In my last video, I talked about gaming's greatest triumphs of 2020. In this video, I want to focus on the many blunders and embarrassments seen throughout this year. And there's a lot to talk about, so let's just dive right into it. Just keep in mind that this is stuff that I've covered. Maybe there's something you can think of that won't be in this video that you think is worth spotlighting, in which case just share in the comments below. But I've got 18 events, news, or games that I want to highlight. And so we've got, for number 18, Google Stadia. The reason it's pretty low on the list is it didn't offend per se throughout 2020, but it also didn't make a big splash to make it more relevant either. And now with xCloud having launched, Series X and PS5 out, Stadia just feels less relevant than ever. And while it is growing in its library of games, it is getting more and more features slowly, little by little. It's nowhere near in a state where people are gonna take this as an alternative to traditional local hardware gaming. Stadia should really treat cloud gaming as a companion to local hardware gaming, not competition, and that's where I think they're going wrong. Not to mention the business model of spending $60 on a game that you only gain access via the cloud rather than being able to download and do stuff with. That business model is still the Achilles heel of Stadia, and 2020 wasn't the year of Stadia. They just didn't do anywhere close to enough. Number 17, Epic versus Apple. So on one hand, I do agree with some aspects of Epic's lawsuit against Apple in the sense that Apple is engaging in antitrust and they are being very much anti-competitive with their iOS policies. But on the other hand, the way Epic has been approaching this with things like hashtag free Fortnite, the comparisons to 1984, at one point, CEO Tim Sweeney compared this whole situation to the civil rights movement, saying that it's everybody's duty to fight, trying to recruit gamers and media outlets as part of his army for his corporate war. Like, it's just an awful, awful look. You want to fight your corporate war? Fight it, but don't act like this is everyone's fight, like this is the fight of our lives, when it's really not. It's just Epic wanting to get more Fortnite money and Apple wanting to get more Fortnite money, competing for Fortnite money. And we're not gonna feel sympathy for a corporate war that is ultimately being waged for relatively selfish reasons. Number 16, Microsoft kills Mixer. Recall that Microsoft acquired Mixer back in August of 2016, and then in 2019, they gambled big by signing Ninja and Shroud as exclusive streamers on Mixer. I don't know the exact figures, but no doubt a lot of money was involved in that exchange. But only a year later, on July 22nd of 2020, Microsoft decided to shut down Mixer because it just wasn't drawing in the audience and attention that the platform needed to be sustainable. So these streamers who were signed on got a huge paycheck and are now free to do whatever they want. So that's embarrassing enough on its own, but their awful handling of communication was rather egregious. They didn't tell most streamers that the shutdown was happening. A lot of Mixer streamers found out on the day of, and suddenly their career, everything they've built has been uprooted, and they were forced to migrate somewhere else without being given a heads up. So that was awful handling on Microsoft's part. Number 15, the Atari Vcs. So this is basically a $400 underpowered PC in a retro casing. It's made to look like the Atari 2600, and the design does look pretty neat, but the shady marketing surrounding this, can you even call it a console? Again, it's just more of an underpowered PC, like taking pre-orders before the product was even being manufactured, not paying their lead architect, forcing him to leave the project's development, working on ports of games without telling the developers, without developers' permission or knowledge, reports of just general behind-the-scenes incompetence, the fact that the console is launching with really no real new exclusive first-party games or any games of real substance. And for the consumer, there's just no value here. For $400, you could get a digital PS5. You could get an Xbox Series S and have some money left over to buy some games. You could get 2 Switch Lites or 1 Switch and a bunch of games. You know, there's so many better ways to spend $400, and the behind-the-scenes shadiness surrounding this product only mars the optics surrounding it that much worse. It's just a product that I don't see taking off, and something that a lot of people see as something of an embarrassment in 2020. Number 14, PS5 and Xbox Series X scalping. It's basically the one thing that's marring the momentous launch of next gen, which is now current gen. A lot of the shortage is due to high demand, but a significant contributor are indeed scalpers, who have these automated bots that can make thousands of purchases before a human being can make one, and that leads to crashing websites and stock running out before a lot of people get a chance to add a product to the cart. And so we've seen stats like over 120,000 PS5s and Xbox Series sold on eBay and StockX combined just on those storefronts alone. Walmart reported recently that they blocked over 20 million bot attempts in 30 minutes when PS5 first went up on sale for pre-order, and that's just a fraction of the total number of attempts as of today. Retailers have a lot of work to do to secure their websites better, and Microsoft and Sony need to come up with their own solutions, because it feels like scalping just gets worse and worse as the years go by, as bots get more sophisticated and whatnot. Number 13, Nintendo and their constant smearing of community goodwill. So when it comes to Super Smash Bros., recall that they recently canceled a major tournament, the Big House, because the organizers dared to use this mod, Slippy, that would allow players to play Melee online during a pandemic, which, you know, is appropriate and it's the safe thing to do, but Nintendo was like, no, it involves using an emulator and it involves using a ROM of Melee, so you cannot do that. And so the Big House was forced to cancel the event. And then after that, Splatoon players actually showed solidarity by changing their team names to something that showed support for Smash players, so stuff like #FreeMelee. And so what does Nintendo do? They cancel the final stream of that Splatoon event because of this peaceful protest, and the backlash surrounding that was pretty substantial. It's just one thing after another. Nintendo constantly seems to be going out of its way to over-enforce their copyright and just causing unnecessary harm to the relationship between the company and their community. So that was kind of crappy. Number 12, GameStop. I mean, where do I begin? The way they handled the pandemic and how they didn't supply their workers with sanitation tools to keep everything sanitary. And so employees were at risk of exposure. Customers were at risk of exposure. They refused to abide by lockdown restrictions because they claimed that they were essential business because they were selling keyboards and mice and webcams. Eventually, law enforcement got involved and forced GameStop to shut down some of the stores that they were keeping on. And then GameStop did actually close down, like permanently shut down a bunch of stores because the pandemic didn't help the business any. And then they ended the year by hosting a dance contest where the winner would get to work more hours during Black Friday, essentially treating working hours like a game. Customers aren't particularly enthralled by their experience at GameStop. A lot of the employees keep sharing horror stories, and media outlets continue to report on all of the shady happenings surrounding this company. Number 11, Halo Infinite. The gameplay reveal for this game was supposed to be one of Microsoft's most important reveals. This is Halo, basically their Xbox mascot. When the game was revealed, though, the reception was mixed. A lot of people felt that the graphics looked not super next-gen. It did look kind of rough for a game that was supposed to be out by December of 2020. A lot of people noticed pop-in and some graphical issues that didn't bolster confidence in the title. Character models and environmental details were lacking, and everything had this kind of plasticky and toy-like feel. And then there's Craig. I don't need to say much about Craig. Backlash worsened when they announced Coatings, which is basically a cosmetic customization system that sounds very similar to how Destiny 2 treated cosmetic customization, and clearly Coatings are meant to be monetized, though they can be earned via gameplay. A lot of people are questioning the idea of colors being paywalled when changing colors was just a basic feature of past Halo entries. We have learned that from leaked marketing material that coatings could be $5 a pop, and those prices may vary. This is a free-to-play multiplayer mode, so there's some room for monetization, but colors, it's just such a basic feature that should not be monetized. That, combined with the graphics backlash and just the general feeling that there's something wrong behind the scenes with Halo Infinite's development, it's just created an environment where people are worried about Halo Infinite, though they did recently release some blog posts saying that they're listening to feedback. They've delayed the game to bolster the game further and to meet the standards that people expect, so maybe things will turn out all right in the end. But for 2020, Halo Infinite did not have a particularly solid and positive reveal. Number 10, Warcraft 3 Reforged. Somehow Blizzard couldn't even get a remaster of a classic, right? Recall that when it first launched, it was essentially just a stripped-back version of the original Warcraft 3, of classic Warcraft 3. And Blizzard went as far as forcing players of Warcraft 3 Classic to upgrade to the less feature-complete Reforged. And it was a disastrous enough launch that Warcraft 3 Reforged held the title of the worst user-rated game in Metacritic history. And right now, it is still at 4th worst user-rated game with a user score of 0.6, only beaten by Madden NFL 21, which is not a high bar to meet. Yeah, as far as Blizzard disasters go, this is definitely up there. And this is all without even considering the false marketing surrounding Reforged and the higher fidelity cutscenes and remastered elements that they showed that didn't end up making it to the final game. Number 9, Ubisoft. Something that rocked the games industry was the reports of misconduct among higher-ups in Ubisoft and the abusive work culture within the studio. And beyond just the crunch stuff, we're talking about employees being treated like shit, being yelled at. A general frat-like environment is what a lot of developers reported among higher-ups who treated staff under them just inappropriately, making shady advances, especially on women. Higher-ups knew about all of this. Plenty of people tried to report this, but nothing was ultimately done about it until the articles and exposés started to come out. That's when the publisher finally acted like they cared, and Yves Guillemot stepped in and said, oh, we're going to make all of these changes, we're going to restructure the company. And they did force out certain higher-ups out of the company, major players who were with the company for years and years and made key decisions surrounding which games got greenlit and which didn't. So at least there's that, but Yves Guillemot has yet to take any responsibility, yet to admit his own complacency in all of this, and only time will tell whether enough changes will happen where the abusive, toxic work culture will be completely dispelled. Number 8, Marvel's Avengers. An Avengers video game sounds like a dream come true, but unfortunately Square Enix decided that the developer should just make a generic looter live service with bland gameplay, repetitive missions, ultimately unsatisfying rewards, loot, and progression. And they rushed the game to release, so it was an unpolished technical mess at launch. Just all around a very forgettable experience. The campaign was okay, but it didn't take the characters far enough. And this is all culminated in a player base that has very rapidly diminished. And checking recently, actually, despite the launch of the Kate Bishop expansion, the player base really didn't see much of a boost on Steam. It just feels like all interest surrounding this game has been lost, and the only way to save it is to just really overhaul the game in its entirety, Anthem style or Realm Reborn style. But for now, it looks like they're just going to keep trying to release new content and hope that eventually the game becomes compelling enough. We'll see if that happens, but in 2020, Marvel's Avengers turned out to be a huge disappointment. Number 7, Fast and Furious Crossroads. I released 2 playthroughs of this game. The game was short enough where I figured, I don't know, might as well entertain you guys with my gameplay experience of this title, and it's just not good. I usually enjoy Vin Diesel's performances, you know, but in this game he sounded bored. Just all of the actors across the board sounded like their heart wasn't really into this game. The driving mechanics, all you do in this game is driving, and driving feels like ass. The set pieces, while fun in their ideas, because of the poor execution of the overall gameplay and the visuals and the sound effects, everything really, it all just kind of falls apart. It's a very monotonous, just awful feeling game that is fun to laugh at on occasions, but is more often than not frustrating. It's just not a good game, guys. And for a multi-billion-dollar franchise, this feels unexcusable. They could have done so much more. Like, I feel like there is a good Fast and Furious game that can be made. This one ain't it. This is as cash grab as it gets. Number 6, The Calling. So The Calling 1 was one of the first battle royales and was positively received. It was developed by this development studio called Xavient, and the game had its own identity. People were drawn to it. But then The Calling 2 came out. It tried to rip off other battle royales that gained significantly more popularity, and in the process, The Calling lost its identity. Players left in droves. It failed epically. Eventually, the game got shut down, and then after that, Calling 1 also got shut down. Then the game re-released. They rebooted the game, essentially, but with an awful monetization system, a pay-per-match system that allowed players to play 1 free match per day, and if they won a match, they would win tokens that would allow them to play more matches. If they were out of tokens, which was the more likely scenario, given that in a battle royale, only one survivor comes out. So if you were in a situation where you ran out of tokens, you could pay for tokens as if they were premium currency, or pay for a weekly, monthly subscription that would allow for unlimited play. After the unceremonious end to the Calling 1 and 2, after all the community badwill, they thought this was the way for the Calling to make a comeback. The backlash was pretty severe. People couldn't believe that they would implement literally one of the worst monetization systems ever, pay to play, not even pay to win, pay to play. After the backlash, they did change things so that it's 10 tokens per day, so 10 free matches per day, but that didn't help, and it was missing the point. The monetization system that was implemented should not exist at all. And the end result to all this is that looking at Steam charts now, pretty much nobody is playing this game. This game has been completely abandoned. It is a complete and utter failure. Number 5, shitty publishers. For this segment, I decided to compile a bullet list of shady things that publishers have done this year. Let's start with Take-Two. This year, they utterly destroyed an indie studio going by the name Star Theory Games. Basically, what happened was Star Theory Games signed a contract with Take-Two to publish Kerbal Space Program 2. At one point, Take-Two wanted to acquire the IP. They sent a proposal to the studio heads. The studio heads didn't like the terms. They said no, so Take-Two decided to cancel the contract, then contacted all of the devs at Star Theory Games to poach them, and so Take-Two founded this new studio, Intercept Games, comprised of those poached developers. In the end, they acquired Kerbal Space Program 2, left Star Theory Games to rot, and eventually that indie studio shut down on March 4th of 2020. Take-Two was also the publisher of Borderlands 3, and you may recall that despite the financial and commercial success of Borderlands 3, Randy Pitchford screwed his staff members, the developers, out of promised bonuses, and a lot of developers had actually made plans based on the expectation of those bonuses. Meanwhile, Randy, at the start of Borderlands 3's development, received a $12 million bonus from Take-Two. Beyond that, we have Activision, who pissed off shareholders after overpaying CEO Bobby Kotick, which is reminiscent to how EA shareholders actually rebelled against EA and denied their ability to give executives a multi-million-dollar raise. Blizzard employees under Activision protested wage disparities at one point by spreading this spreadsheet compiling salaries and wages and really highlighting the awful disparity. Focus Home Interactive, this is a publisher that tends to focus on indie games, and among the titles that they're publishing is Aeon Must Die. The development studio of that game, all the developers quit because of mistreatment, late payments, just general theft of IP and corruption. So that Aeon Must Die trailer that was shown during the PlayStation event, it was comprised of essentially stolen assets as well as assets that were outsourced by the publisher, but the developers are no longer working on this game. They've all quit. So this game is now being made by developers who weren't part of the original team. Another indie studio who got screwed was Frogwares, the developers of the Lovecraftian game The Sinking City. Nacon, the publisher, essentially engaged shadily. They were late with payment, withheld payment. The publisher tried to get the developers to give them their source code so that the source code could be used for another game that the publisher was releasing. And then there were last-minute cancellations to bonuses, a lot of contractual obligations that were not fulfilled. And so Frogwares was forced to terminate their contract with Nacon and forced to take their game down from Steam. Then we have 505 Games, who took the goodwill of Control and marred it by refusing to upgrade existing Control players who own all of the content to the Ultimate Edition, which grants a free next-gen upgrade. So players who already own the game, who were the initial adopters of the game, are getting screwed out of a next-gen upgrade. They have to repurchase the game to get that next-gen upgrade, which is bullshit. To make matters worse, 505 Games insisted that a free upgrade was impossible, and then not long after, they accidentally upgraded some players to the Ultimate Edition before undoing it, which exposed their lies. So these are just some examples of publishers who did really shitty, questionable, or really dumb things throughout 2020. Now, for number 4, there is one publisher who deserves a special place on the list: Electronic Arts. A lot happened throughout 2020, from EA dropping support for the thriving Battlefront 2. They did eventually actually fix the game, and the content additions were compelling, but with a lot of stuff still missing, they decided to end support for a game that was actually starting to pick up and get some good reception. Battlefield 5 has been a disaster from beginning to end, and they didn't get to the major World War II events before cutting the game support short, and a lot of the gameplay tweaks and balancing were never quite right. Their EA Sports launches have been some of the most egregious. Madden 21 currently has the lowest user score on Metacritic with a score of 0.2. Sims fans revolted at one point because EA decided to release Star Wars content that was last place in a poll that was conducted. There were so many other things that fans have been asking for, and what does EA do? Give them the one thing that they least want. Going back to EA Sports, they decided to experiment with in-game ads by implementing them in UFC after the game's launch and acting like, oh, we didn't know the players would receive it so negatively. It did get pulled eventually, but that was after backlash that they feigned ignorance to, which is reminiscent of how 2K tried to add ads in NBA 2K21, and then when the backlash got pretty severe, they backtracked that and claimed that that was added by accident, which obviously nobody believes. And then going back to EA, they advertised FIFA loot boxes in a kids' toys catalog in the UK at one point, and after backlash, they had to pull that. The launch of FIFA 21 Legacy Edition for Switch was pretty humiliating when people discovered it was literally just a copy and paste of FIFA 19 Legacy Edition and FIFA 20 Legacy Edition, just with a slight roster update. EA's shady loot box antics has led to 3 class action lawsuits being issued against them, 2 from California and 1 from Canada. So yeah, EA continues to be as shady as they've always been. They continue to be the butt of the joke in the games industry. Speaking of shady business practices, for number 3, loot boxes. A lot actually happened this year surrounding that, with more government officials and organizations scrutinizing the practice. So I've gone ahead and compiled a bullet list of key developments surrounding loot boxes. Starting with January of 2020, the National Health Service Director slammed loot boxes, called for their ban. On February of 2020, Spain announced plans for looking into loot box regulation. Moving to April of 2020, the ESRB announced that they're going to be adding this useless random items label to try to stave off backlash surrounding the fact that their labels don't warn people of the dangers of loot boxes, which are literally just gambling. On June of 2020, the UK called for evidence to classify loot boxes as gambling. On July of 2020, the UK House of Lords called for the immediate regulation of loot boxes. On October, the Dutch court shot down EA's arguments for the inclusion of loot boxes in FIFA, and because EA refused to abide by their gambling laws, they were fined 10 million euros. And finally, in December, UK research showed statistics pretty damning against loot boxes, talking about how many young gamers fall into debt as a result of loot boxes and their struggle to keep track of their loot box spending, among other things. So loot boxes got quite the beating this year, and game publishers continue to make asinine arguments in their favor, despite ample evidence showing that they pose a genuine psychological and financial danger. Number 2, Cyberpunk 2077 and CD Projekt. Cyberpunk 2077 was supposed to be the game that will end 2020 on a high note, but instead, leadership fucked up big time, screwed over the developers by rushing them to release the game, and so the game launched unfinished, unpolished, in an unacceptable state on last-gen consoles. Marketing was shady, the review process was manipulated in an egregious way, did not allow reviewers to show footage until the game launched, and no reviewers were given the console version of the game because clearly CD Projekt leadership knew the dire state the game was in on last-gen consoles. There was intentional deceit that took place here. It was just a deceit that you wouldn't expect from CD Projekt, of all companies, who have consistently touted themselves as the consumer-friendly AAA publisher and game developer, who have consistently touted the game will be out when it's ready. But they obviously lied to us. The leaders, the heads of CD Projekt, lied to us, and the developers were forced to bear the brunt of the backlash. And now we're at a point where investors also feel misled and lied to, preparing multiple class action lawsuits. There's plenty of backlash from the community, from media outlets who no longer will trust CD Projekt Red on the level that they once did. That goodwill and trust completely flushed down the toilet, with CD Projekt facing an uphill battle to win that back. And publishers, even Sony, went as far as removing the game from the PlayStation Store because of the way CD Projekt handled refunds and made it seem as though refunds were guaranteed if people just contacted Sony, when nothing as far as guaranteed refunds was organized. And once it was organized, Sony decided it wasn't worth the trouble of keeping Cyberpunk on the PlayStation Store. So a bunch of sales were missed out there. Microsoft is now guaranteeing refunds. More bugs, more issues, more missing features continue to be highlighted amongst the community. Though the game still sold 13 million units by December 20th, though analysts expected that sales could have been significantly higher without the backlash, without the removal from PlayStation Store, without the mass refunds. And just from the 8 million pre-orders alone, the game managed to make back its development costs, so it is far from a commercial failure. In fact, this is one of the biggest game launches ever, the biggest PC game launch in history. CD Projekt made a boatload of money from this. They're far from doomed, but their stock has tanked by like over 40% since December 4th. Investors are now worried about the company's future, given how much reputation and goodwill they've lost, given the delays that are inevitable when it comes to the game's DLCs, expansions, and the separate multiplayer component. The worst part to all this is that underneath it all is a gem. Underneath the rubble is a gem. You can see what the developers were going for. I can imagine how much better this game could have been if it had been given an extra year of development time. I can see the potential there. I can see the love and care and passion the developers poured into it. But leadership didn't give them time to fully realize the potential of this vision. Because the expectations were so high, because CD Projekt Red was held to a higher standard, that made the fall from grace that much more painful, that much more impactful, that much more unfortunate. I do think that the stuff Cyberpunk does get right, it gets really right, and I do believe that if leadership handles things properly and if developers hunker down, it is very much possible for Cyberpunk to make a strong comeback. But that doesn't excuse this situation, doesn't make this any less of a shocking situation. Again, nobody expected this from CD Projekt, of all companies. But at least there is a chance for a comeback, whereas number one, Crucible, is dead in the water. Many of you probably haven't heard of Crucible because this game was so poorly marketed. This is Amazon's first major AAA release. It is this online competitive game that's an amalgam of a hero shooter, a battle royale, and a MOBA. It's shipped with 3 distinct modes, with one mode in particular getting more traction than the others. And poor marketing aside, the game just had a lot of issues, a lack of polish, balancing problems. One map that was used for all 3 modes, which doesn't make sense. You want to build maps that tailor to the different modes and their different gameplay requirements, and not build modes around one map that isn't gonna fit the mold of all of these different modes. Overall, the gameplay just wasn't as well conceived as people would have liked. There were a lot of interesting ideas here, just the execution was poor. And so what we're looking at here is a game that had a decent launch with 10,000 concurrent players on Steam, but that number waned rapidly. We eventually got into the triple and eventually the double digits. And the game did so poorly that it eventually went back into beta. The game literally unreleased, went back to beta, scaled down its focus to 1 game mode instead of 3, so the other 2 modes were canceled outright. But even that wasn't enough. Months later, on October of 2020, the game was completely shut down. This is a game that launched so disastrously that it unreleased, went back to beta, and then imploded. It just went completely dead. Cyberpunk was a higher profile disaster, but it made its money back. It performed really well commercially, and there's enough goodness in there that you can see the potential of the game and the fact that it can absolutely come back from this. The Crucible is dead in the water, and the pre-launch, the launch, and the post-launch were a disaster across the board, and the game has no chance to come back. And that's why the Crucible, to me, is the number 1 most disastrous blunder / embarrassment of 2020 in the realm of gaming. Thus concludes my top 18 list of gaming's worst blunders of 2020. I hope this proved to be a good roundup, and hopefully this can serve as a cautionary tale for game publishers and higher-ups in particular of what not to do for a successful video game launch, for just a successful video game period. And again, there are some things that maybe I didn't mention that maybe you took note of. Share those in the comments below. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.